Starting the stream, and we're just waiting to get the okay that the stream is looking good. All right, everybody, we are live. Welcome to our first Heptio Arc Design Sessions. This is going to be a series of meetings that we're recording. Oh yeah, everybody wave. This is going to be a set of meetings that we're recording. The intent here is basically when someone on the ARC team is working on a feature and we want to talk about design, to do so in a high bandwidth manner. And as we were discussing it, we're like, hey, why don't we just do these out in the open and public and streamed and recorded? So we will have a playlist of all of these as we do them. This is our first one, so we kind of are figuring out the format as we want to evolve how the format goes. So what we're going to do today is we're going to do some quick intros, go through some announcements, and then begin. So Steve, why don't you go first?
Hey everyone, I'm Steve Chris, work at Heptio. I'm a senior engineer working on the ARC team and playing the feature lead role for 0.10, which is the release we're working on now.
Am I up next?
Yep.
All right, I'm Andy Goldstein. I'm the ARC project lead. I'm also at Heptio, and happy to have people check this out. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Nolan Brubaker. I'm a software engineer here at Heptio, and I'm also working on ARC.
I'm Carlisia. I am also a senior engineer, and I am the most recent member of ARC. And yeah, excited to talk about Snapshot Locations.
I'm Wayne Wetzel. I'm a senior engineer also on the ARC team.
Hey everyone, my name is Ross Kuklinski. I'm a senior product manager here at Heptio, and I oversee a lot of our open source projects, and one of my favorites is ARC.
Awesome, and I'm George Castro, and I will be your host today. I'm the community manager at Heptio. Before we begin though, Carlisi is gonna go through some announcements. We had some great contributions from some community contributors that we'd like to do a quick shout out to.
Yes, I'm going to try to pronounce the GitHub names, actually handles, best I can. So first up is, I can pronounce it, so I'm going to spell it out, TW Foreman. Okay, that was a hybrid. For the member leak report. And next up is Sachinar, S-A-C-H-I-N-R-A-R. And okay, this is really hard. Bash of man with 2 N's at the end for reporting the issue causing Restic restores not to work. And the last one is James Powys, P-O-W-I-S, for the PR to discard service account tokens from non-default service accounts on restore. So just to reinforce that we welcome contributions, we welcome PRs, and we welcome issues too. So if you find any issue or if you have any suggestions for ARC, just open an issue and talk to you.
Yep, and I routinely send out swag to contributors. We're in the middle of changing stores and stuff, so once we get a new format in place, we'll get back to you on that. All right, so let's talk about the topic first. Steve, why don't you start just give us a quick TLDR, what exactly we mean by snapshot locations, so I don't have any assumptions here. Or
Sure. So what I actually wanted to do is, before we jump into the snapshot locations discussion, do a little bit of a demo and discussion about a couple of the other things we've been working on for 0.10. We have some pretty big and hopefully exciting changes coming. So I thought I'd just run through those real quickly. So let me share my screen and I'll go through a quick demo. Everyone can see my terminal okay? Great.
Yep.
So the first thing I wanted to demo is backup locations or backup storage locations, and this is something we've been talking about for quite a while. But the idea here is that we want to enable ARC to be able to put backups in multiple places. So you can set up different buckets that maybe you want some backups to go to bucket A and other backups to go to bucket B. Those could be in different regions if you're interested in separating things geographically. And as part of that, we also enabled storing backups under prefixes in an object storage bucket. So you no longer have to store everything in the root of a bucket. This could be really useful if you have multiple clusters that you're using Arc on, and now rather than having to set up a separate bucket per cluster or per Arc install, you can just put them all in the same bucket under different prefixes. So I wanted to run through a quick demo of what that looks like. So I have the latest version of Arc installed in a cluster here. So the first thing I'll show is just the backup locations. So I have two set up here. So the first one is the default. You can see the provider's GCP, and then the actual location. I have a bucket, and this one I'm storing under the primary prefix. And then I also have a secondary location, also GCP, and it's under the same bucket, but under a secondary prefix. So the first thing I'll do is just create actually, let me show you. I have the Nginx example installed. This is the standard example that we use in our repo. So I'm just going to go through backing up that namespace. So first thing I'll do is just create a backup foo, and I'll include the Nginx example namespace. And I'm not going to specify any backup location here. And so Arc is actually going to use the default, which it identifies based on a server flag that you provide in the Arc deployment manifest. And so when I do this, it's going to go create that backup, and hopefully we'll see it in this default location. And just telling the logs on the bottom here. So if we now look at the backups that we have, so backup foo completed, and you can see the storage location is listed as default. And so we can actually go look in object storage, and this is my Arc bucket. You can see the two different prefixes here. And so if we go under primary, here's the foo backup, and you see the JSON file, the logs, and the actual tarball. So that all worked as expected. So now let's create another backup. Call this one var, and instead of putting this one in the default, we'll actually specify a location. So here I'm just going to specify secondary, and actually just going to use the -- wait flag, which is something that that is new, which just has your CLI wait for the backup to actually complete. All right, backups completed. So if I look at the list of backups now, we have the bar backup stored in the secondary location. So that all looks good. And if I flip back over to here and look in secondary, there's our bar backup. And again, we've got the 3 files. And so as I mentioned, you can set up locations that use different buckets, can be in different regions. And so hopefully this gives folks flexibility in terms of where they store their backups, and give some additional levers to use there. The next thing I wanted to talk about is another change that we're making in 0.10. And so you may have noticed this as I flipped through here quickly, but I'm actually going to flip to a markdown doc for this. So in versions 0.9 and prior, in terms of how Arc stored data in an object storage bucket, basically you just had a single bucket that Arc used. We didn't enable any sort of prefixes. And then each backup just became a directory essentially within that bucket. And so within each backups directory, we would have the 3 standard backup files, and then any restores of that backup, the log and results files would also go under that backups directory. And we've come to realize that this is a little bit limiting in terms of how it's organized, because if we need to store additional metadata or other information within the Arc bucket, it becomes hard to distinguish between what's a backup directory and what's a different piece of metadata or a directory containing other information. And so in 0.10, we're reorganizing how data gets stored in the object storage bucket. And so the first thing is that, as I showed with the backup locations, you can now use a prefix within a bucket to store all of your backups, and that's defined per location. The big change is that we're introducing 2 kind of top-level directories within the object storage location. there will actually be a couple more coming, but the main one is the backup subdirectory. So instead of storing each backup in the root, we're going to put them all under that backup subdirectory. And then we're also going to separate out restores into their own directory. So we'll have a restores top level directory, and then each restore will get its own subdirectory under that with the logs and results file. The nice thing about this is that it lets us add additional top level directories as we need them to store other types of information. And so one example of this is that we're working on a change right now so that if you're using Arc's RESTIC integration, you can actually start storing the RESTIC data under the same bucket and same prefix that you're using for all of your Arc backups. So in 0.9 and prior, you had to have a separate bucket to store your RESTIC data. We're now just making it easy to store it within that same bucket, so you don't have to have so many buckets. So this is definitely a breaking change. We've written up some instructions and provided a script to help move your files around so that they can be put in the new 0.10 layout. But if you try to upgrade to 0.10 without running the script, the server is going to complain that your backup repository is structured incorrectly and point you to this page to actually run through the script. So I think that covers the two things that I wanted to cover. Anyone else have anything to add there? Okay, great. Well, so now we'll kind of jump into snapshot locations, and this is kind of an analog of backup locations, which I just talked about. So Nolan is going to cover kind of an overview of the feature and talk a little bit about what the API changes are to support that.
Yeah. So let me share my screen. All right, so you should be able to see GitHub page now. So currently in Arc, up to the 0.9 series, we had this.
Sorry, Nolan, could you zoom in a little bit, maybe twice? Perfect, thank you.
Good. Yep. So in versions up to 0.9. We had this config object or this config CRD in Arc, and in there we had definitions for your backup storage, which Steve just showed was moved into some new stuff for the backup locations. And we also had the persistent volume provider, so you could define where you were getting your persistent volumes from and how to snapshot those. With this new change, we're moving this information into a separate CRD. So you see now we're using a kind of volume snapshot location, and we are just having a spec on it to define what provider you're using. So right now, cloud providers and also anybody who's written plugins like Portworx and whatever config those providers would take. So you can define multiple snapshot locations, and this will lead into some replication stuff later. As a very a brief overview, we introduced the new CRD as the slide shows. We will add, I'm honestly not sure what that sentence is meaning, but you can add multiple snapshot locations per provider. So you can have multiple providers and you could have multiple snapshot locations. And we can configure them individually. And the backups will say where they go. So you can choose to send them to different locations. There's currently some tricky things with sending backup snapshots to zones or locations that your cluster isn't in. So if you were in GCP US West and you tried to take a snapshot and immediately send it to US East, That's not going to work currently, but we're working on a replication feature that will build on top of this to take those and copy them over to whatever zones you might want to have for redundancy. I think that's largely it. Does anybody have anything to add there?
Yeah, I wanted to mention, so you can pre-configure, I don't know if this is the right word to use. So you can pre-configure, so correct me if it's not, you can pre-configure multiple backup locations, volume snapshot locations, but at the time of creating a backup, you can only choose one to use
Right.
per provider.
Yep. One per provider right now. Yep.
Yeah, and so just to add a couple of things there. So we've been talking about the concept of a provider for a snapshot location, and so in Arc in its current state, you can only snapshot a single provider's backups or volumes. So, for example, if you're running on AWS, you can take EBS snapshots. But if you were running on AWS and using both, say EBS, if you're running on AWS and using EBS and Rook, for example, Arc does not support taking snapshots of both of those volumes at the same time. And so part of what we're doing here is adding support for multiple providers for volumes and snapshots, so that you can actually take snapshots of both EBS volumes and Rook volumes, for example, at the same time in the same backup. The other point I wanted to make is that, so as Nolan said, a lot of this sets the groundwork for replication, which is a feature that we'll be implementing in 0.11. But even in 0.10, I think the snapshot location feature adds value in some scenarios. And one example of that is with Portworx. So Portworx is a storage platform that you can use with Kubernetes, and they've written an Arc plugin to be able to take snapshots of Portworx volumes using Arc. And so Portworx has two different types of snapshots that you can take. So you can take local snapshots, which are just going to keep the snapshot data on the Portworx infrastructure. Alternately, you can take cloud snapshots, which actually upload that data to the cloud somewhere. And so in Arc 0.9, in the current state, if you're using Portworx, you have to just choose one of those and use it at the server level. And so if you want to change from using local to cloud snapshots, you actually have to change the Arc config, and this requires a server restart. And it's, if you want to go back and forth between the two, it gets pretty clunky in terms of having to constantly reconfigure the server. And so with the snapshot location change in 0.10, a user could just set up two different snapshot locations for Portworx. So they would both have the same provider, being Portworx. Actually, Nolan, could you make that a little bit bigger? Great. Yeah, so you see local snapshots and then cloud snapshots. But so with snapshot locations, you would just configure two different locations. They'd both have the Portworx provider, but the config would be different. So you would basically have a local config for the local location, and then you would have the necessary cloud config for the cloud location. And then for each backup that you take, you can choose whether to use the local or the cloud location. And one of these could be made the default for the Portworx provider, so that you don't have to specify a location every time you're taking a backup, but you have the option to choose a different one if you want to. So I think even without replication, I think that's a good example of why this feature has value on its own. And then, in terms of just kind of talking a little bit about how this does relate to replication, which is a feature that we're planning to implement in 0.11. Eventually, we want to be able to take an Arc backup, including volume snapshots, and make additional copies of it in different places. And so typically that would mean different regions. And there could be a couple of different reasons why users want to do this. The first one is for redundancy. So you have multiple copies of your backup in different places. In case a region becomes unavailable, you still have access to a secondary copy of that backup in a different region. And so as part of that, we're going to use the concept of volume snapshot locations to allow a user to specify a replication policy. And this will define essentially what additional locations backups should be replicated to. And so you may have a backup that's taking snapshots into, say, AWS's US East 1 region, but you want to replicate that backup to US West 1, US Central 1, et cetera. And so volume snapshot locations will define those additional places where the backup goes. User might also want to replicate backups so that they can actually just restore them in different regions. And so if you're trying to migrate workloads from one region to another, replication will allow you to copy those snapshots across to a different region so that they can easily be restored into a cluster in a different region. So, so hopefully that gives everyone a sense of kind of why we're building these features and how what we're doing in 0.10 kind of sets the groundwork for 0.11. So we did want to, we're sort of working through the development of this feature right now, and we have run into kind of a few different issues that we're going back and forth on and talking about how we want to implement. I guess the first one that we sort of ran into is initially when we were talking about snapshot locations, we were thinking that you'd be able to specify when you're taking a backup, you'd be able to specify that you wanted your snapshots to be stored in a region other than the region where the cluster is and where the volumes are. And so, for example, if you have your cluster running in US East 1, we were thinking that you'd be able to take a backup and say, I want my snapshots to be stored in US West 1 for this backup. And in terms of how you actually implement that for something like AWS, AWS doesn't let you create initial snapshots in a different region than where the volume is. The initial snapshot always has to be in the same region. And so the way that this would work, if you wanted to do this, is that you would take a snapshot of your volume and it would be in US East 1. You would then copy that snapshot, which is a separate API operation, into the US West 1 region. And then finally, you would probably want to actually delete that original snapshot that was living in US East 1 now that you had the snapshot in the US West 1 destination. But what we realized as we started to kind of prototype and implement this is that that three-step operation can become pretty time-consuming, especially if you're trying to do it during a backup. And so with AWS, for example, you can't copy a snapshot into a different region until the original snapshot has completed. And if you have large volumes, this could take hours for the snapshot to actually complete before you can do the copy. And so all of a sudden we're looking at a scenario where an Arc backup doesn't take just a few seconds or maybe a minute or two, but could actually take hours to finish executing. And this had the potential to introduce some kind of significant issues because Arc currently only executes a single backup at a time. And so if you have a backup that all of a sudden is taking multiple hours to complete, then any other backups are going to be blocked in the queue until that finishes. And so we've sort of decided that for now, when you execute a backup, you'll only be able to create a snapshot for your volumes in the same region as where your cluster is. And this is going to vary a little bit per provider. It's kind of a per provider constraint. But so with AWS, you'll be limited to only creating snapshots in the same region. And then replication will be the feature that will allow you to actually copy those out to other regions. And that will be a new controller or a new set of controllers that will actually take into account kind of the time it takes to copy these things and manage how many copies are running concurrently, etc. And you know, oh yeah,
hey, Steve,
go ahead.
sorry.
Yeah.
I just wanted to point out that the snapshot copy slowness issue is probably a bigger deal because Arc has been designed on the assumption that creating a snapshot is cheap in terms of time, that we can issue the request to create a snapshot and just move on. Whereas this would be changing it to not just issuing the request, but sitting around and waiting for it.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Right now, yeah, we consider a snapshot created. Essentially, it's a point in time thing that happens more or less instantaneously, even though in the background there's data copying asynchronously. But yeah, like Nolan said, that would change if we had to do copies. We talked about whether this would be kind of a significant limitation for users, and we didn't really think so. I mean, I think, you know, it seems that the most likely scenario is that if you're taking backups of your volumes, you probably at least want to have snapshots in that same region. That, you know, that makes it really easy to recover in kind of the normal case within the same region. You may additionally want to copy them out to different regions, and that's what replication is for, but we didn't really think it was a major use case to want to take a backup and have those snapshots stored only in a different region. And so I think we feel pretty comfortable with that constraint that we're introducing for 0.10. You know, there's kind of a related issue to this, which is when you go to do a restore, how do you know where you should restore your volumes? And so currently what Arc does is when you take a backup, Arc actually records the region and availability zone that each volume that's being snapshotted is in. And then when you do the restore, Arc just looks at that metadata and sees where the original volumes existed, and it restores those snapshots to new volumes in those same regions and AZs. And this works fine for restoring, you know, into the same cluster or in a cluster, you know, a replacement cluster that's in the same region or AZ. But if you're actually looking to restore backups into a cluster in a different region or AZ, this becomes problematic because we don't really have a way to specify that. So we need to have a way to kind of specify where the volumes should be restored into, which region and which AZ. And so I know we've kind of gone back and forth on a bunch of different ways to do this. There's metadata on the node objects in Kubernetes that, at least for some cloud providers, give information about the region AZ. We've also talked about having this be a command line flag or a server flag. Nolan, I know you've been looking at some of these options. Did you have anything you wanted to add there?
I think, yeah, probably the best source is going to be those nodes. Not all the cloud providers currently set that information, so we need to see what we can do to get that. And I don't know what that's going to look like for on-prem. It may not matter as much though. So yeah, the main thing is going to be making sure that whatever cloud provider you're setting up with is tagging the nodes, and then the assumption will be that your nodes are all in one region, not spread across multiple. Yeah, that seems like the most reliable way so far, but it's still not 100% guaranteed yet.
Yeah. Anyone else have anything else they wanted to add on that topic?
I think this is something that we should really try and get community input on. There was one person in Slack this morning who was asking how to do this exact thing, restore a snapshot into a different region or zone than where it originally came from. You mentioned a server flag, Steve. I don't think that's an option for us. I think that's too restrictive. So I think either we need to try to intelligently default or force it to go wherever the cluster exists, which unfortunately, I don't believe the Azure cloud provider currently includes information about the region or zone in the labels on the node objects. So we probably should reach out to the Azure team and see what's going on there. The other option would be specifying a volume snapshot location as part of the restore, I guess. Maybe one per provider or something. I think the UX here is going to be hard to get right to solve everyone's use cases, but maybe we can get to 80% if we can either go with the node labels or defaults for picking the volume snapshot locations or something.
The other thing that I would just throw out here, and this is not fully baked, but possibly until replication is there, possibly doing an explicit copy command, say copy my snapshots from this volume snapshot location to this one before doing the restore, but that's also not fully baked yet. So we may be able to investigate it, but it may not work out.
For the bit where Andy said we need more user feedback, I think on the restoring to another region, is that what it was?
Oh, it's where if you've got your volume is in one region and zone to begin with, we take a snapshot, and then you have a cluster in some other region and you want to restore your backup in there.
Yeah, I was just wondering if it might be worth, since someone brought it up in Slack also, busting that out as a separate question to have on the list. And then maybe either reference the video.
You mean in the Google group?
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Yeah, I think we should post it and see if we can start having a discussion. Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
Cool.
So where are we in the agenda here?
Well, I think we definitely covered a lot of just an overview of the feature and kind of where we are. I can give a quick update on where we are in terms of development. So we're in the middle of the snapshot location development. So we've implemented the new API, so defined the new CRDs. We're working on setting up the Arc server flags that specify the default snapshot location for each provider. We're also working on the core backup controller changes. So this is both validating and defaulting the volume snapshot locations that are specified for each backup that a user takes, and then also modifying how the Arc's backup implementation works so that it instantiates a separate block store for each backup based on the types of volumes and the locations that those snapshots should go into. So really kind of getting into the middle of it. We still have to go through all of the controllers that we have in Arc and update each of them to not just use a single block store, but be able to use several based on the locations and the providers that are specified. Let's see, we've been using ZenHub to kind of track and manage our work lately. And so we have a ZenHub board that's available that's linked to our GitHub repo that folks can take a look at if they want to see which specific issues are actually in progress and what's still on the backlog. Nolan's pulling that up right now.
And if you're watching this on YouTube, the very first video, the office hours, we go over how we set up this board. So if you have any questions on that, or if you just see it and get confused, just ask one of us, and we'd be happy to walk you through it.
Yeah.
And you can blame the scary product manager.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I've actually found it really useful just to see at a glance what each person's working on and see how much stuff is left before we can kind of get into final testing for the release. So I think that's pretty much all that I have. Definitely, kind of a call to any community members, any users, or anyone who has input on this and who has thought about kind of cross-region use cases and and whether what we're implementing kind of solves the needs or whether there are additional things that are necessary. Yeah.
All right, and then we'll for sure take the notes and publish those on GitHub as well. We haven't really decided like on a naming scheme where we're going to start publishing the notes of these, but once we do that, we'll go ahead and publish that on the Google group as well, so people that can follow along. So, any final comments or questions for the 3 people watching live? Let me just look at the channel real quick. There's about a 10-second delay if anybody has any questions. Somebody's eyes are glazing over. Okay, I don't think that's related to us.
Yeah, separate discussion.
Yeah. All right.
I would also mention something, sorry, this is a little late, but something else that's coming in v0.10 is a little bit of a plugin rewrite, which we are currently updating our examples for, and we hope to have documentation out for how to get your plugins migrated. It's not a huge amount of code that you'll have to change, but there will be a break between 0.9 and 0.10 for plugins.
Do we have an issue for that?
We do have a couple. We have a couple issues. I can find it here in a second.
Yeah, I would just feel comfortable if we were to announce that on the list sooner rather than later.
Fair enough.
When unless you're going to keep changing stuff, like when you feel like.
No, I think most of the changes are done. So really, it's just getting the docs. Buttoned up for that, and then
even if it's just a heads up, hey, even if the docs aren't done, this is coming, would kind of help. Just a bit of a courtesy call, I think.
Yep.
Yeah, we definitely should be sending that out to the list. I've been in contact with some of the other plugin authors, so like they know that it's coming. But reaching out through the mailing list is the right thing to do.
Yep. Totally intended to put it through the mailing list. I was waiting to get the documentation done, but I can also just send a heads up.
I mean, I don't. When do you
documentation?
When do you think the docs will be done? Like, it's like a few hours. Then
I could probably update those today and make sure they get merged. But end of week is probably a realistic.
Okay, make a judgment call, but
deadline.
Let's try to be as heads up-y as we can for people that are writing plugins. We
also want to put out at least one beta, I'll call it, maybe a couple of them prior to the official release of 0.10. So we need to make a decision on how feature complete we want to be before we put out a beta, but it's possible that we'll put one out soon that has the plugin changes and the backup location changes, maybe not the snapshot locations quite yet, but at least give people something to start using for testing. So stay tuned for that.
Sweet. Anyone else have anything to add? All right, coming up next is office hours. In about 2 weeks, this time I'm going to change things up a little bit and have the YouTube URL set ahead of time so that we can share that more effectively, and hopefully new splash screens and a whole bunch of other stuff. But
actually, George, that'll be next Tuesday.
Is it next Tuesday?
Yeah.
Not this Tuesday coming up, the one after, right?
I believe it's October 2nd.
I see it on the 9th.
Yeah, mine says the 9th.
Okay, my mistake.
Okay, good. All right. As long as we collectively know what we're doing, we should be okay. All right. Excellent. And with that, this concludes the first design session, and this repeating invite will keep on going out to the list, and we hope to have different topics for you every time. And we'll see everyone in about 2 weeks. Thanks.